What's up guys, it's Will back again, and today I'm here because I'm burdened with glorious purpose. I'm here to talk about Marvel's greatest villain, Loki of Asgard. Now it's no secret that Loki is the MCU's greatest villain. You can probably find a number of different videos and articles talking about it, but I want to dig a little bit deeper and explain just why Loki is so popular among the Marvel fanbase. Well, to start, part of the reason Loki is so popular is because of his villainous peers. I'm a big fan of Marvel films, but to not acknowledge that they have a villain problem would be silly. As of me recording this video, there's been 17 movies in the MCU thus far, and almost always the villains are one-offs, meaning they show up for one movie, they're defeated, and you don't really see or hear about them ever again. Marvel has succeeded despite these issues because their heroes are so rich, and that's partly because they've elected to put all their eggs in the hero basket and kind of leave the villains fairly underdeveloped. Loki, however, is the exception to that rule. He's had 3 movies now, not counting Ragnarok because he's not really developed in that film, where he's received significant development and played key roles either as a villain or an anti-hero of sorts. We've had lots of time to connect with Loki, to understand what drives and motivates him, what his flaws and his weaknesses are, and his general outlook towards power and status. Part of the reason we all love him so much is because we actually understand him. We've spent time with him, and we feel attached to him, and that simply cannot be said for any other Marvel villain thus far besides maybe the Winter Soldier. Marvel has made a very concerted effort to develop Loki, and that can't be said about any other villain in the MCU, not in any significant capacity at least. But that isn't the whole picture. Loki isn't just the greatest villain Marvel has to offer because there's effort put into his character. It's because he's charismatic and unpredictable. He's the type of villain that's not just pure evil. He's layered in a way that makes him relatable and, dare I say, downright likable some of the time. He often does evil things, but he also has brief moments of heroism that make the audience feel like he's redeemable, to the point where we have to see how his story plays out. A big part of this also boils down to how great Tom Hiddleston is in the role too. I mean, he's definitely one of the best actors Marvel has right now because in my opinion, he's delivered the most compelling character Marvel has to offer, period. Loki is much more than just a villain, and I think that's a big reason why he's considered one of the best characters in the MCU, but certainly the best villain. I mentioned charisma earlier, and that's certainly one of the biggest factors at play here. Loki has a way of winning over audiences, despite the fact that he'll do just about anything to achieve his goals, and a lot of that boils down to how cunning and mischievous he is, which is something that's sure to be a crowd pleaser, despite the less than noble end goals. Regardless of the terrible things he does, we're positioned to see the good in Loki because Thor does. Thor is our hero and the primary lens through which we see Loki, and despite his best efforts, Thor often chooses to trust in Loki because he believes deep down that there's good in him. He knows that Loki is consumed by a burning feeling of inadequacy, and that he feels the need to prove his worth to those around him, specifically his family. Although Thor doesn't agree with Loki's reasoning, he does generally understand it, and by extension the audience does too, and many of us empathize with Loki. He's a sympathetic villain that way, which is rare. I also mentioned that Loki's unpredictable, and that's another big reason why he's a great villain. Being unpredictable keeps the audience on their toes, and that's something a villain needs to do consistently. The villain is in direct conflict with the protagonist or heroes, and he or she needs to be both strong and imposing and unpredictable. Now Loki's not unpredictable in the way that say a villain like the Joker is, because he's not an agent of chaos. His end goal isn't to cause anarchy. Loki is the god of mischief, and he's always scheming and up to something, but he has an end goal, and that's to be recognized as a king, which he believes is his birthright. Although a lot of Marvel villains have relatively clear motivations, Loki's special because his motivations are deeply ingrained in his personality, and they've only grown over the course of 3 films. In Thor 1, Loki desires equality and possibly the throne because he craves said equality, and he believes the throne is his birthright, but he also believes that he'd be a wiser and better ruler than his brother Thor. He goes to great lengths to prove to Odin that he should be king by trying to destroy the entire race of frost giants. But first, he tricks Thor into disobeying his father's wishes, which ultimately results in his banishment and removal from the consideration for the throne of Asgard, a move entirely unpredictable to many. In Avengers, Loki is at the point where he realizes that Odin is not going to make him king of Asgard, no matter what he does, so he takes matters in his own hands and aligns himself with Thanos so that he can take Earth and be named the ruler of Midgard. Once again, Loki will go to almost any length to receive the recognition, praise, and the throne that he desires. At this point, he believes he's been cheated and that he must forge his own path to take what he believes is rightfully his. Thor tells Fury that Loki craves power, but he also craves vengeance, and that's definitely true. Loki feels like he's been slighted his entire life and that he's always lived in his brother's shadow. He explicitly tells Thor this when he pulls him from the shield ship and tries to return him to Asgard. When Thor tells Loki that the throne would suit him ill, he becomes visibly angry because that musters up those feelings of inadequacy that he's felt his entire life. In this moment, he feels cheated again by his brother who has always overshadowed him. But we can go all the way back to Thor 1, where Loki finds out his true parentage, and we can see that this moment is where he feels the ultimate sense of betrayal. He sees himself as a stolen relic, a pawn in Odin's political game, and he resents him for it. In this moment, we feel bad for Loki. We feel that although he's done some bad things, he may just be a victim of circumstance, and that he certainly has more depth to him than many villains these days, especially villains in the current MCU. But it doesn't end there. Loki is consistently in an internal tug of war. On one hand, he hates his family because he feels betrayed by them and like a pawn in their game, but on the other, he loves them because they are his family. He hates that he loves them because he can't help it. Loki has a special connection with Frigga in particular, and despite his best efforts to separate himself from her, he just can't. He cares for her because deep down he knows that she cares for him. Despite all his internal anger and resentment towards his family, he can't let go of them, particularly not his mother, who he knows is in fact looking out for his best interests. In Thor 1, Loki tells Thor that he never wanted the throne, that he only wanted to be his equal. This is just an excellently acted scene, but you can tell when Loki denounces his family here, it's tearing him up inside, and this is one of the few times you see him physically express that turmoil on the exterior. He shows a moment of weakness because he's overwhelmed by the conflict that's only growing within him. He's consumed by it, and he's overwhelmed with rage, anger, and resentment towards Thor for all the years he's lived in the shadows of his greatness. Even in Thor 2, not long after Loki's informed of Frigga's death, he tries to retain his tough exterior, but deep down, he's a mess. Once he reveals his true form to Thor, he shows an image of vulnerability that we rarely see from villains. In this moment, we once again are positioned to sympathize and even empathize with Loki, who just helplessly lost his mother, the only person who still believed in him. This moment further positions the audience to view Loki as a sympathetic and complex character that many audience members will inevitably cling to in all his flaws. But in order to be a good villain, he has to be formidable too. In the Avengers, Loki proves the best and most complex villain the Avengers have faced to date because he's strong, he's clever, and he's full of tricks and surprises. He's also pretty ruthless as well, because at this point he's desperate to prove himself and he'll do just about anything to invade Earth and prove himself capable. He kills innocent people, he threatens in the most sadistic of ways, he mind controls, and he also kicks ass when necessary. It helps that we know about Loki before the Avengers, but even if we didn't, we'd probably still love him because of how menacing and cruel he is. In the Avengers, Loki doesn't crack very many jokes. He's not a simpleton. He's a clever, manipulative, and calculatingly ruthless villain that is a stark contrast to almost everything the Avengers stand for. But even though the Avengers should all unify against Loki, he's smart enough and clever enough to get them to fight amongst themselves so that they're less powerful because they're divided. His deliberate plan to divide the Avengers is nearly successful because of how well executed it is. Loki is a formidable villain physically, but especially mentally because he's extremely crafty and manipulative. Loki is the MCU's greatest villain because he separates himself from the pack in a number of different ways. He's actually developed, he's clever, he's extremely well acted, he's layered, he's formidable, manipulative, and unpredictable, and he's at times sympathetic. Loki is my favorite character in the MCU, and one of my favorite characters period because he's so dynamic. He's a ton of different things at once, and that allows him to transcend base level villain status. Loki is Marvel's greatest villain because he's much more than that. He's a deeply flawed yet deeply layered character with a well-defined backstory that explains his flaws. Not every villain needs to be as complex as Loki is to be effective, but Loki is dynamic in a way that no other villain in the MCU thus far has managed to be. He's beloved by many for being a complex villain, with his villainous logic deeply rooted in his personality and growth as a character. Loki is so many things at once, and he manages to balance them all brilliantly, so much so that he's captivated audiences in ways that only a few comic book villains have thus far. Loki of Asgard is an ambitious character who burdens himself with glorious purpose, and that's what makes him Marvel's greatest villain. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, or concerns, voice them down below in the comments section. Until next time, this is WillFoxification signing off. See you in the next video.